Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Keldealysis channel. I'm your host Keldealysis, and today we're talking about Murder on Eridanos. I had originally typed out a script going over what I'd like from a single-player DLC. While setting up the outline for that script, I realized that Murder on Eridanos is most likely exactly what I'd want from such a thing. It offers a new setting, has its own personality, a fun story, amazing characters, and new additions that are unique, fun to use, and translate well to the base game's gameplay. Murder on Eridanos is the second DLC released for Obsidian's The Outer Worlds, a single-player RPG that I am on record putting among my favorite games of all time. While looking at the DLCs of various games as objectively as possible, I found that Eridanos has a lot of elements that I think make best for the total package. So instead of talking about the base game or getting too deep into the DLC for the matter, I just want to do a quick overview. Murder on Eridanos might very well be the single-player DLC that I've had the most fun playing through. I want to take the opportunity to sit down here and talk about why I think it works so well as bonus content. Without further ado, let's investigate the Murder on Eridanos. Let's start with how we've typically been starting, by acknowledging the gameplay first. Murder on Eridanos does what I personally feel all good DLCs should: give the player more of the same. You're paying for downloadable content. You want something new to try that still falls in line with the rest of the game. Well, I think Eridanos does this to a T. Starting with, let's go over the science weapons. Murder on Eridanos adds new science weapons to the game, two of which I want to mention as I find them to be the standout ones. First one I want to mention is the Spectrum Gatling. Classified as a long gun, it's a hunk that holds 80 rounds per mag and can spray with an increasing fire rate as you unload. The science effect on this weapon is that each shot alternates between damage types, so if you have a standard enemy, you're throwing every damage type at them at the rate of essentially a trace weapon. The other science weapon I want to mention is the Needler, one of my favorite weapons from any video game. The Needler is a handgun that deals meh damage and fires 2.5 shots per second. So far it doesn't sound like anything to write home about. What's fun about the Needler is how it works. The Needler is an infinite ammunition weapon, meaning it doesn't require any of your ammo stock to use. It simply fires away. While that sounds broken, you may need to keep in mind that the weapon has a slow rate of fire and doesn't deal much damage. Well, the other part of the gun is that you can switch between one of 3 effects to load it with. Instead of reloading the gun, pressing the R key will change which chemical is loaded. Each chemical has its own effect and can stack with itself and one another to apply to whatever is shot. Costollerine will lower the target's armor, Riddle-Life will poison the target, and Debillerol will slow the target and hinder its movement. This is just a very fun weapon to use in my opinion, and it has a really simple, cool design that just screams badass. Good weapons have good balancing factors to keep them fun to use. If a weapon is just stupidly overpowered, then all the fun is lost. Like I said with the Needler, while it inflicts stackable status effects and also has unlimited ammo, it isn't really a reliable weapon to use in the conventional sense, with its poor stats and all. And the Spectrum Gatling, while it takes a while to get going, but once it does, it not only goes through ammo like DSP going through his life savings, but it also becomes insanely hard to control. These simple balancing factors help make these two weapons even more fun to use, and they both really stand out for me personally. Now these weapons wouldn't be worth shit if they served Eridanos and only Eridanos. Well, I'm pleased to say that these two weapons, and all others in Eridanos, all work well in the gameplay of the core game. Well, all except the discrepancy amplifier, I suppose. Regardless, a good weapon that's locked behind a DLC should translate well to the base game, and dang near every weapon from this DLC all work well enough to keep the general gameplay loop and meta of the base game intact. If there's any negative I have regarding the gameplay, it's the whole ending to the main questline. While the narrative and stakes are alright, the actual gameplay becomes generic and not as interesting. You do end off with a fight against a giant slug monster, but even this falls flat. For one, the animations and line delivery in the pre-boss cutscene is weak as hell, but also the boss fight itself is an absolute pushover. Mama Slug is just a bullet sponge that doesn't really put up much of a fight. A very disappointing end to the climax. What is the typical RPG game loop without quests? Well, the side quests of the DLC are all varied and really fun to play. While there aren't an insane amount, each one is different and actually quite fun to take the time to do. And some, like in the base game, will reward you with unique weapons and gear. Others are just worth doing because it's something fun and new. Speaking of quests though, let's talk about the story quest, more specifically how it gamifies the investigation. The story of Murder on Eridanos is that of a murder mystery. You're the investigator trying to determine who the killer is. I mentioned before how the discrepancy amplifier isn't a gun worth using gameplay-wise. That's intentional, as it's not the point of it. Instead, the gun is used to investigate discrepancies or crime scenes to provide context or look for clues. This actually has a much greater effect than it sounds. Instead of the story requiring you to talk to a person, go somewhere, talk to another person, so on and so forth, you are actually treated like an inspector and you have a unique way as a silent protagonist to uncover the clues and analyze the case on your own. Of course, you'll still talk to various characters, and we'll get to that, but the small act of you, yourself, going to the sites and uncovering the clues on your own does a whole lot for immersing the player. Not to mention that the discrepancy amplifier is a gun that speaks, and it came before High on Life, and unlike the critters from High on Life, the discrepancy amplifier is actually funny.
This unit has been programmed to offer encouragement during moments of emotional strain. Banter protocol activated. We'll find this rat bastard's responsible, Inspector.
One of the most standout parts of Murder on Eridanos are the characters featured. As I previously stated, the story is a murder mystery. A majority of the main story is looking into various characters connected to the murder and figure out whether or not they have strong alibis that clear their name. In some games, this would be very cut and dry, no substance or intrigue whatsoever. Luckily for us though, we're playing the Outer Worlds and every character is beaming with their own personality. One standout character is Cedric Kincannon, a character that is so smug and confident that he comes across to the player in a very pseudo-intimidating and off-putting manner. His character is introduced to the players so early on and has such a strong foundation. Even though he's a little silly and he does bad things, you know, like throwing people off the land into space literally.
I had his body dropped off the edge of the land complex. I'm not sure what happened to it from there, scientifically speaking. Maybe it dissolved? Ultimately, though, it doesn't matter.
He is still a well-defined character with a strong moral compass.
This is a betrayal, Inspector. I do not take betrayal lightly. Helen should consider herself very lucky indeed that she is already among the dead, and that some other bastard beat me to putting her in the ground.
Not only all this though, but he has just his own unique personality that is not seen anywhere else in the game, and he has some of the best lines in the entire game as well. For a further example, let's look at the character that Cedric is at odds with throughout the entire main story, Administrator Ludovico. Ludovico comes across as a stern figure of justice that just wants to solve this case by any means necessary. He's part of the corporations, there is a murder on his property, he has to figure it out. Realistically though, he's a slimy gremlin that's trying to cover his tracks. There's just something so entertaining about watching him bicker with Cedric, talk down to others, and even get defensive and insult you once you finally figured him out. He's such a slimy prick and you just can't help but to love him.
I don't see any other dim-witted inspectors around, so yes, you.
Now I've already said a couple times now that the story is a murder mystery, but I just want to take this minute to emphasize that this is not only a really great hook, but it's also done extremely well. I personally feel like the main narrative is a lot better than anything else in the Outer Worlds. Like, it instantly hooks the player and gives you enough to think about, introduces various characters with their own motives, and like I said with the discrepancy analyzer, it manages to put the player right in the middle of it, and it has you be the one to piece it all together. At the climax, you're asked to determine a suspect based on all that you've learned thus far. You really are the investigator making your final call. Who is this killer at large? Well, it's up to you to make the decision. I think this whole aspect is done very, very well. Now, while I'm talking about the climax, I want to talk about the actual twist in what happens. So, here's your spoiler warning or something rather. I've already said spoilers, but better late than never, I suppose. So, Administrator Ludovico, the guy that hired you for this job, is actually the initial killer. He killed Halcyon Helen and is what spurred off this entire chain of events. And it's up to you to determine this, and you do determine it because every suspect has a strong enough alibi that clears their name. Who else could it possibly be? After you go to the first potential killers and confirm their alibis, you begin to realize, yeah, this is how it's going to work for every character, isn't it? And sure enough, that's how it works. A character gives you a story, well, you leave to confirm or deny their story, and return to tell them what you found. After that, you go to the hotel penthouse, which acts as your team's hideout, use the computer to tell Ludovico that the person checks out, and then you do that for the next suspect. It becomes a tad bit repetitive and predictable. That said, I don't mind this loop too much during the act because all of the characters are super enjoyable to interact with. This does become a problem at the actual climax, however. Ludovico is the villain, and you saw it coming from a mile away. Halcyon Helen also has an identical twin, and she's the one that's been this extra killer at large. Like, there was an initial killing that Ludovico is responsible with that killed the actress Halcyon Helen, and then her twin sister killed 2 other people, and she's the one you're trying to track down. This, too, is like insanely predictable. Like, nothing is really said in game, but it's presented as a cop-out more than anything. And I'm not joking when I said that I predicted both of these twists halfway through my first playthrough, the week that the DLC came out. It's just so obvious through the load screens, logs, clues, etc. And I know the Outer Worlds intentionally plays up the cheeky and corny tone of the old serials, but this revelation really does just take the wind out of my sails every time. Like, it did so good at hooking me that it decides to hit me with this. Talking about the tone though, Murder on Eridanos hits you with both unsettling vibes as well as corn through and through. Through characters like Cedric, you're struggling to know his intentions. He has no solid proof to back his alibi. He is off-putting in his personal encounter because it heavily contrasts the charm that he previously showed to the player. Hell, when you start out on Eridanos, you'll come across people that have worms sprouting from their necks and they're smiling like they just watched my Persona 3 Portable video. Check that video out, by the way. This too is super flipping unsettling and helps build up the mystery of what's going on around Eridanos. All of this is in stark contrast to the more cheeky characters like Dr. Goodnight and Spencer Woolrich. I love the blending of tones, as it really does help complement the variety of characters and the story as a whole. And finally, all that's left to touch up on is the world of Eridanos. Visually, it's unique to all the other planets from the base game. Eridanos is a gas giant, and the land that you're on are artificial masses that are held up by massive thrusters and stabilizers. Each mass is segmented and connected via these bridges that all connect to the middle where the hotel is. Not only is this a new idea for how the map actually looks, but the layout is unique and makes bouncing between the areas and the hideout for your investigation really easy. Traversing this map is never a pain, unlike it can be in places like Monarch in the base game. And this really goes without say, but I think that the world itself is beautiful. I think the Outer Worlds art direction is one of its strongest suits, and believe me when I say that Murder on Eridanos continues to knock it out of the park. Like, the environments are just jam-packed with so much color and style that it falls right in line with what we've come to know from the other planets in the game, but ultimately, it stands on its own. Comparing the environment and color palette to the others, you'll easily be able to tell which is Eridanos, which is a true testament to how good it is. And that's a super quick look at Murder on Eridanos. What does it do well as a single player DLC? Well, it stands on its own through the gameplay additions, the main story, new characters, and the world it all happens in. The story, while predictable, has a really good hook. The characters all have unique and expressive personalities that make each and every last of them memorable, and the gameplay loop is certainly the Outer Worlds. While the new stuff works really well on its own, it follows suit with the rest of the game to provide the player with what they've come to expect. As a $15 expansion, I'd say that as a huge fan of the base game, I certainly got my money's worth out of this DLC. I'd argue that it does everything right that it needs to, and it is a quality follow-up to the core experience. And that's all I have for you today. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. If you have any thoughts regarding Murder on Eridanos, then please let me know down below in the comments section. I could talk endlessly about this game. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You'll want to speak with Ella Tinsley, the warehouse foreman. I've cleared her as a suspect myself, but should she refuse to cooperate, shoot her. No, I'm joking. If she won't cooperate, tell me and I will shoot her.